ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As usual, video is not working because the broadcasting program hates me for some reason. But we will be. I do have a guest with me tonight, which would be Matt Swayne, author of Ghosts of Country Music. Matt, why don't you? I always like to let you guys do this yourselves because I think it sounds better. But why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Matt Swayne. I'm actually a full-time. I'm a research writer at Penn State. I was born on Halloween, which would explain a lot of my literary production. So, as someone who's been born on Halloween, I was drawn to ghost stories and horror movies and all the other stuff. So I started collecting ghost stories when I was a reporter for a daily newspaper, probably back in the mid '90s. And over time, I've collected, a lot of these ghost stories about universities. And then I got into writing a little bit about ghost stories of rock and roll, which became my second book. And this is my third book for Llewellyn, which is called Ghosts of Country Music.
Okay, cool. I hadn't known actually about the Ghosts of Rock and Roll, but that certainly also fits in here if you want
Yep,
to delve into that.
sure.
So, as I mentioned to you, I'm actually a big country music fan. Um, when I think of music, and I think of like the paranormal, country isn't obviously there's a classic "Devil Went Down to Georgia," but normally I would think more of blues than country. Is there a lot of weird goings on with country?
Country music is actually pretty weird. Yes. And you and I just discussed how we always get, because we're country music fans, we get called weird a lot. But actually, what I found, and if I can give you a little bit about sort of the evolution of this project,
Please do.
I had just finished up writing about haunted universities. I work at a university, and I've collected those stories for really decades. So that seemed like a logical point to start off with. And then my acquisition editor asked if I had anything to follow up with that. And I remembered a couple stories about Elvis Presley's ghost, or the fact that he was still alive. And then I read a book uh, by Gary Patterson and some of his works, and he actually explores more of the cursed occult side of rock and roll.
Mm.
And he mentioned some ghost stories in there too. So I kind of was feeling pretty cocky apparently, and I said, "Yeah, I'm going to do this book about haunted rock and roll." And she asked me pretty much the same thing you said: "Is there enough to do a story?" And oh, of course. But so I really didn't know. But as I delved into it, I found so much about the paranormal ghost stories of rock and roll. And as you point out, a lot of it comes from the blues background. Robert Johnson, who sold his soul to the devil to be a better blues guitar player, is probably the quintessential rock and roll story, and it's influenced the mythology of rock and roll for since its origin. So I don't know whether that has somehow creeped into rock and roll, but I have a lot of theories about that. But as I was writing this, and usually when I'm writing these stories, the first thing I'm looking for stories that are compelling, and I try to make them as credible as possible. And even I approach this really as a journalist, not as a paranormal researcher. So I sort of draw the line between what I call ghost lore, which is folklore that is centered on spirits and ghosts and whatnot, and actual accounts of people who have had experiences with what they consider the paranormal. So I consider those ghost stories or stories of the paranormal. Uh, but what I found is, as I was researching this, is there's an incredible amount of ghost lore and ghost stories about rock and roll, and I step away from it. After I'm writing these stories, then somehow I start thinking, why do we tell these stories? Why are these stories so prevalent in rock and roll. And my idea was at the end of that book was that there is just something special about rock and roll in the blues. And then this next project, something special that attracts fans and musicians to the occult or to the paranormal. And so that was kind of my theory. And then I decided, after getting a few snippets of ghost stories as I was researching rock and roll about Hank Williams and Patsy Cline, I decided, to pursue that, and I found equal amounts of ghost stories, I would say, in the country music genre as there are in rock and roll, in the genre of rock and roll. And so now I kind of rethought about this theory about, okay, so rock and roll seems to be pretty haunted. Now all of a sudden country music seems to be pretty haunted as well. And I started to think about this. And really, if you think about spirituality, if you think about religions, I can't think of any type of religion that doesn't use music as part of its worship service. So now I sort of feel that there's something special about music. I think music is a spiritual technology, and it can be used in the religious sense, and it also, I think, can be used in the secular sense of outside of the church and outside of religion. And that's why I think that there seems to be a spiritual affinity between musicians and the supernatural. And I think there's an affinity between spirituality and the music fans themselves. And so when you get that all together, you really have at least some pretty solid bricks in the wall of why we have these ghost stories, and why a ghost story can last for literally decades, which is something you see in haunted rock and roll and in ghosts of country music.
I think you have a legitimate point. Just thinking about it, I mean, I can think of a couple of denominations that don't use music just because they have very conservative, strict
Mm-hmm.
rules about that kind of thing. But the vast majority, I mean, all of the major religions, there's definitely musical elements, and
Right.
most of the denominations, even there's musical elements. Further, as an investigator, um, yeah, when one of the things when you're working on a violent haunting, which is my specialty, um, when usually you're dealing with relatively low level entities, when they try to bring in their boss, as it were, you'll hear
Mm-hmm.
chimes, musical
Wow.
notes, and the understanding that we as investigators have is that music itself is a form of summoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've come across that on a couple different stories that I found. One of the stories that's popping into my brain right now was the entity haunting that became the movie The Entity. And reading the account about that, there was one point where the investigator said that the activity was responding to the music, and I think the music at that time, the one boy was playing Black Sabbath, I think, or maybe Ozzy Osbourne, which will do it
Yeah.
apparently.
No, actually, it's
So.
funny you mentioned that one. When I back in the day when I used to do a radio show, we had one of the investigators from that case on, and I got a chance
Mhm.
to talk to him about it. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and it was why I was sort of drawn to it to pull that some of those pieces out. And I do think I interviewed the researcher involved in that, and I'm blanking on his name, but
Yeah, so am I.
he's kind of a heavy one of the pioneers in that. And I asked, I really wanted to know what the song was, and he said he couldn't remember, but.
Oh, that's such a
Uh,
shame.
Yeah, to your point, if you think about music, even beyond music, but think about rhythms and drums and chanting, uh, just about every religion does have that aspect of it.
Without a doubt. And again, the rhythm, the drums, the rhythm in some of the older primal religions, and
Hmm.
that's the ways, I think particularly within voodoo and its related religions, it's like that's a very important part of their religious ceremonies and bringing the attention of their gods. Plus, from a psychological standpoint, we know that music has a very profound effect on people's psychology and emotions.
Hmm. Hmm. Definitely. The other thing that I've talked about before is music is actually very mathematical,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the rhythms, whether it's the harmonies. So you're really using your whole brain. You're using the creative side of your brain, and you're also using that analytical side of your brain to mesh it. So it's a whole brain activity. Now I'm totally out of my element right now in saying there's a neuroscience between spirituality and music, but I think I've said this and I'll say it again. I've done two books pretty easily on the ghosts of country music and haunted rock and roll. I have yet to be able to even start one on, the ghosts of accountants or uh, marketing managers. I mean, there just is something special about music, musicians, and fans of music, at least in this field. I know we're going to get some mad accountant who has a ghost story, but I'm
I'm
going to be
certain
willing
there
to.
are.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if
The,
I've ever run into an accountant with a ghost. I can't say that I can remember one off the top of my head, but
right, right.
but generally speaking, I don't think you get where you get with some of these. I'm guessing they're tied very much into the person's work. Certainly, some
Hmm.
of the legends about Johnson, he got his ability to play the blues from the devil. I
Right.
don't think I could be wrong, but I'm thinking that crunching numbers as an accountant doesn't summon Satan.
Yeah, you go to the crossroads to become a better accountant.
You never
uh,
know.
you never know. Hey, whatever works for you. Um, the other thing that I will say plays a big role in these ghost stories, and you as an investigator would know this, is the amount of tragedy that follows some of these folks. In rock and roll, you have Buddy Holly.
Hmm.
In country music, you have Patsy Cline, and Hank Williams certainly lived a pretty rough life. So that element of tragedy mixed with this profound sense of spirituality, I think just becomes a breeding ground for both ghost lore and ghost accounts.
It makes sense to me. The other thing that occurs to me is, especially we were talking about Patsy Cline, Buddy Holly, you know,
Hmm.
Elvis Presley. These are such iconic figures.
Yes,
Stories and rumors and legends are inevitably going to come up around them.
yes.
Um,
These are big personalities, and you use the phrase "larger than life" quite a bit, and somehow that becomes very apropos for this work. These these people, whether and there's so many different theories out there. On one hand, skeptics will tell you, well, fans just don't want to leave, let their idols go, so they're going to
mhm.
keep them around with ghost stories. And to be honest with you, I find that fascinating. So even if that is true, um, that's fine with me, and I think that's worthy of talking about, writing about, and researching. On the other hand, there are these stories that seem to be outside of the realm of folklore and ghost lore, of people, honest people who have had run-ins or have seen things that they can't explain. And then you get this idea that maybe the person themselves, the spirit themselves, maybe that's larger than life, and that's why it still is part of our plane of existence.
Mhm. I don't think the ideas are mutually exclusive either. I mean, as an investigator, I run into cases where there's nothing there. Where
Hmm.
people think they have a haunting, but they watched a horror movie really late at night and they spook themselves.
Mm-hmm.
or the raccoons living under the floor make them think that the house is possessed.
Right.
Um, but to the skeptic, they look at those instances and go, "Well, there's nothing there. This is always the case."
Mm-hmm.
For me as an investigator, I, I think that there are times where people are, I think a lot of the idea that I'm pretty sure Elvis is dead. I'll put it like
Yeah.
this. And while I think it occurred to me years ago, it's like, wait, what if the reason everybody still sees Elvis around is they're just seeing his ghost?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's some legitimacy that maybe something like that is going on here. But the legend, I also adore folklore and ghost lore and things like that. And I think there's value in the legend whether or not it's objectively true.
I agree.
I mean, it says something about our culture. It says something about our society. It says something about particularly about how we view these people.
Right. And I think you bring up a really great point about the aspect that they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
In fact, I find this, and when I'm writing this, I really honestly try to approach this as an open-minded skeptic,
Mm-hmm.
a skeptic in the truest sense, as I don't really know. I really don't.
That's a
Um,
good position to take.
and what I find myself is, as I'm writing this, I start it out and I'll say, "Oh, okay, well, this is ghost lore," and then all of a sudden I'll start being more of a believer, and then I'll go back to being I ping pong back and forth, and maybe that's really the key. The key might don't take this as an either or situation, but rather as a both and situation. And not only are they maybe not mutually exclusive, they might be interrelated in ways that is hard to fathom. Because I really sometimes see these the ghost lore seems to be much older in a lot of these cases, and then all of a sudden you'll have a real account. So maybe there's something there that perhaps real ghost stories can create ghost lore,
Mm-hmm.
and that ghost lore maybe has a relationship with the actual ghost accounts. That's some of the things that I think about as I'm, when I started writing these were fun but there's another level to this, and what you said about Elvis was so confusing when I write about him, because first of all, there's an incredible amount of folklore about Elvis not not dying and working at your local Burger King
Mm-hmm.
or wherever. Uh, then all of a sudden you'll read these stories, and actually, there are photos of one ghost story in particular that Elvis was seen uh, early in, soon after he died.
Mm-hmm.
They began to allow fans to tour Graceland, and it wasn't as formal as it is now, because I toured Graceland. It was a very formal thing, and they didn't let you, wander around too much. But during that early time, there were so many ghost stories that came out of that specific time, and one was that he was seen in the pool house. Uh, so, okay, well, a lot of people looked at that and said, okay, he didn't die, and that's Elvis. And then people said, well, there's another layer to this. It could be an Elvis impersonator. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's another layer, which is that the Memphis Mafia, his buddies, used to wear everything that he did. If Elvis had a pair of sunglasses, they went out and got a pair of sunglasses. So it could have been, one of his friends just hanging out. And then the other layer is, of course, that it's a ghost. So it's really hard to tease apart. And quite frankly, I don't want to. I want to tell all the different angles.
I like that. I will say as well, there's another angle I can see here, which is something I've been contemplating more lately because of a particular um, not urban legend, although it's not quite an urban legend. Have you ever heard of the concept of a tulpa or an egregore?
I sure have, yeah.
It's like sometimes I have to wonder if just the level of belief that Elvis is still alive,
Hmm.
maybe there's a spirit there and it's not Elvis. It's something that's created out of the collective belief.
Yeah, I mean, when all the Slender Man stories were popping up
Yeah, that would be
a
the one
couple
where I
years
got
ago,
where this has gotten to my attention.
the same thing happened to me as I was listening to some of those people talk about that. I thought, well, maybe Jim Morrison is the Slender Man. Maybe Hank Williams in certain areas is the Slender Man.
Mm.
It's an absolute, uh, definitely a theory that I thought about.
No, it's just funny because that's exactly the story I meant when I said the sort of urban legend. Because I have
Hmm.
a friend who loves Slenderman, and she's like, yeah, and she's an investigator like myself, and she's made the comment before that she didn't think he used to. Always, we know the origin of the story. We know that the guy who wrote it came out and said, no, 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 this is just something I made up.
Hmm.
But the, with all of the reports and all of the things that have happened, it's like maybe there's something. There wasn't something to it before. Maybe there is now.
Sure.
Just
It,
yeah.
it, and you can even get into Jungian synchronicity
Hmm.
if you'd like to in this situation too. Um, a lot of the skeptics will say, well, if you go expecting something, you'll misinterpret natural phenomena. What I find, and I run the gamut, and just between you and me, I'm super easy to creep out, and I will blame anything on the paranormal. You can ask my wife if a light blows up, it's a poltergeist. Let's get out of here. Um,
I know the type.
so, so you know, I. But what happens is I go to these book signings or I go out and talk to people about the ghost stories of rock and roll and the ghost stories of country music, and I have people invariably afterwards seek me out and they tell me the creepiest stories. And a lot of these people, uh, their lives have changed. Their philosophies have changed. So it's different from someone like me who's just kind of naturally superstitious and easily weirded out to people who have complete changes in philosophy. Now, it's hard to expect, some type of random occurrence, you know, all of a sudden turn them into complete believers. But I have definitely had those chats with people.
I believe it. And you look at these stories, it's like, yeah, okay, the 100th guy who went to Graceland and saw Elvis, yeah, there's
Hmm.
199 other people that have already said that this happened to them. But that first person, it's like, they thought Elvis is dead. They didn't go there looking for him.
Yeah,
What's going on
exactly,
here?
exactly. And the other part about ghost lore, I'm just starting to think about and consider only because it's kind of the way I tell stories.
Hmm.
I've had weird things happen to me, but I can't really go to the level and say that they were paranormal.
Hmm.
But and trying to get people to get firsthand accounts from people about ghost stories is incredibly difficult. Even though off the record they'll tell me these stories, but they don't want their name attached
Yeah.
to some of these stories, which makes me think that a lot of this ghost lore could be created by actual encounters with the weird. I'll just put it that way. That they can't explain, but they don't want to own that story. So, in other words, you say it this way instead of you say, "Hi, I'm Matt Swayne. I was at the Ryman and I saw the ghost of Patsy Cline walking up to me." You say it this way: "Oh, I hear there are a lot of ghost stories about in the Ryman and Patsy Cline is supposed to be there. This one person said they saw and you
Hmm.
start speaking that way, and pretty soon you have the elements of that kind of ghost lore where it's all based on secondhand accounts rather than firsthand accounts. So that's another element to some of these stories.
It is. And okay, so let's talk a little bit about. I mean, this is fascinating. I'm having a
Hmm.
blast. because the theory, I'm an investigator, so the theory of everything really interests me from a technical perspective, and the whys and the hows, and is this, is it that, is it maybe more than one thing? But
Mhm.
for the more um, how, um, I want to say secular, but it's not the right word. For the less, you've been doing this a while. I've been doing this 20 years.
Mhm.
There are people that are listening, undoubtedly, that have never gone out on a ghost hunt in their life, or done anything like either of us have done. So why don't we get a little into the book? So,
Mhm.
without spoiling too much, do you have a favorite story from the Ghosts of Country Music?
Oh, I have a bunch of ones that I really like, and I one of the figures that crops up time and time again as you start researching this is Hank Williams, and Hank Williams was this pioneer of country music, and he was really a great songwriter.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure people realize how great he was. I think he is probably one of American music history's greatest songwriters. But he had this really a wandering, tormented soul, is the only way I can describe it. And the stories that you find about ghost stories that you find about Hank Williams too have this element of a wandering, tormented soul, not necessarily malicious or anything like that. I don't want to put it out that way. But the stories about Hank Williams' ghosts are spread pretty much throughout the South. And, there are a few of the stories are located where he's buried in Montgomery, Alabama. But one of the fascinating ones that came to me was through a friend who it was is a psychic medium, and she was she worked in Nashville for some fan activities off and on, and she was also a medium there, and I think she had maybe like a newspaper column and attracted quite a following,
Mm-hmm.
and she received a letter from one of her fans, one of the people that she corresponded with, who told us about her daughter. And this lady's daughter was going to a high school dance, and she was in charge of chauffeuring her friends around, both from the dance and to the dance, and then afterwards took them back home. And afterwards, it was late, probably close to midnight. And I think all of us have had that phenomena as we're driving late at night. All of a sudden, the territory seems strange and unfamiliar, and we end up getting lost. And that's exactly what happened to this lady's daughter. She dropped off her last charge and went off into the night and got lost and went deeper and deeper into the country. She couldn't. She was running out of gas, and so finally, almost in tears, she pulls over to this gas station, and she realizes she doesn't have any money for gas, and she pretty much had a nervous breakdown right there at the spot. And suddenly, a man appeared. She said, must have walked out of the store, and had a brown suit on, a big 10-gallon hat, very tall, lanky, skinny guy who was very polite, and calmed her down and gave her a few bucks to get some gas, and then gave her some directions to where she needed to go. So she made it home safely. Not too much was talked about. The daughter really didn't say too much to her mother about what happened that night. But a couple weeks later, the mother was a big country music fan, and the
Mm-hmm.
daughter was not. The daughter sits next to her mother as her mother was flipping through a country music fan magazine, and the daughter said, "Hey, stop there. That's the guy who rescued me the other night." And she proceeded to tell her mother the story about this guy, and the mother said, "Well, it wasn't him. It was this is Hank Williams. He's been dead, for decades."
Yeah.
And she swore that that was the guy who rescued her. And Hank Williams has been known for many things, but not being a guardian angel. But the mother said that Hank Williams must have been the guardian angel that night. So I think that's one of my favorites, only because it mixes some elements of what I would consider ghost lore. But according to my friend, this was an actual story, firsthand account from someone she knew and trusted.
It's such a neat story. I mean, the girl didn't know who Hank Williams was.
Right.
It's not like, oh, she's going out looking. I mean, certainly there are ways to explain that the skeptic would come up with.
Sure.
That,
yeah.
Although I'm not willing to make. I mean, especially when I listen to accounts, I'm not really usually willing to make those kinds of judgments because I wasn't there. I don't know.
Right. The other part that the mother did say is during that night, she had a sort of a premonition that her daughter was in trouble and offered up a prayer. And I just don't know how Hank Williams got that call, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, just on a philosophical and theological level, it's a really interesting situation.
Yeah.
I mean, no disrespect to Hank Williams. It's just he's not the person you think of showing up to do that after he died.
Right. Right. There, the other story that I really liked, and I was pleased that I found this out because, I really do approach these things. What I find is a lot of people, I think, write books because they're experts, and
Mm-hmm.
I write books because I don't know and I want to find out. So
It's the journey,
found
not
out
the destination.
absolutely. I found out a lot of neat things about, for instance, the Ryman Auditorium, which I really consider to be the most haunted spot in country music, and the ghost stories there go back to the original. I guess he was the owner of the Ryman, and his name was Captain Thomas Ryman, who was a steamboat captain, and apparently not such a great guy. He was involved in gambling and maybe prostitution, just sort of a bad egg. And
Mm-hmm.
there was a revival meeting that came through Nashville at that time, and the preacher was really converting some of Captain Ryman's best customers. So the rumor is that Captain Ryman went to this revival preacher's service to heckle him and maybe to strong arm him to get out of town to save his businesses, and he ended up being converted. And so the Ryman Auditorium that we know was actually, and we call it the Mother Church of country music, really for a reason, because it actually was a church. And Captain Ryman wanted only religious music to be played in the Ryman. And so there are all these ghost stories about Captain Ryman haunting the place. And apparently he's not really happy that they've started to play country music in there, and they don't play spirituals. And the one story is that when there was one performer on stage who was apparently on the saucy side for Captain Ryman, there were almost, it's described as almost like explosions in the auditorium that grew so loud that it drowned out the performer, the saucy performer on stage. So a lot of people think that this was Captain Ryman coming back to determine who the next acts were going to be.
I love that.
There are just so many great stories like that too.
I bet. And I know from folklore around the country and various stories that people I've talked to, that doesn't seem uncommon with theaters, at least in my experience.
Yes, exactly. And there are some books on just auditoriums and theaters, and of course I have a whole section dedicated to some auditoriums and concert venues of country music, because there are, like you say, there are so many.
Well, you know what they say, everyone's a critic, including the dead.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's funny.
Of course, now that just makes me wonder. It's like, yeah, and the people, all the people out there, they're listening to us right now on the other side.
Right. Oh man.
Not so much with YouTube, but yeah, back in the day of the radio, we'd have things mess with the show from time to
Yeah, yeah.
time. Maybe I should take the fact that it hasn't happened so far as a good sign.
Right. Right on. Uh, the other interesting figure that crops up in country music and country music ghost lore is Johnny Cash.
Mm.
And I was really fascinated to find out some of the stuff that I found out about Johnny Cash, because I think like everyone, I've always loved his music, and I've always considered him, more, and I certainly know that he has this gospel side to him.
Hmm.
But he was actually very, very involved in spiritualism. In fact, there's one section of the book that I consider the paranormal partnership between Johnny Cash and Merle Kilgore and Johnny Horton, who were all really involved in the exploration of spirits. I guess they might be kind of early ghost hunters. And then there's this figure that crops up throughout, as I delved in deeper and deeper into this. His name was J. Bernard Ricks, who was almost like he was a medium. He was also a postman, apparently, and a very mysterious figure who was almost like a guru to those three. And there are accounts of, in one case, Johnny Cash is meditating, and he, almost like a case of psychokinesis, he cracked the roof of Merle Kilgore's new studio, which, yeah, so I guess he probably wasn't invited back. But
It's like,
Merle, by
Johnny,
the way,
please don't meditate in my studio anymore.
yeah, I think Johnny probably in that deep voice said something about he had his volume up too loud or something like that.
Clearly.
There's definitely a Cash saying there somewhere. So I found that pretty interesting, and Johnny Cash, of course, had a vacation home that was notoriously haunted called Cinnamon Hill, and Johnny Cash said, and again, this is when you have someone you respect, someone you trust, someone like Johnny Cash, was almost painfully honest as an artist,
Yeah,
who says
very
that
well respected as a musician as well. I mean,
absolutely, and he, in his autobiography, or maybe he told his biographer, that one evening in Cinnamon Hill there were 5 or 6 people sitting down at the dining room, and they were going to have a dinner party, and a woman in a long white dress appeared at the one side of the dining room, went through the doors that were closed at the time, walked by the crowd, and vanished through the other door. And then all of the dinner guests heard this rapping, this rat-a-tat-tat, that Johnny Cash said he heard time and time again in his stays there. So here you have multiple witnesses, honest people, no reason to lie, who have had this experience. So that to me rises above the level of ghost lore into a full-fledged ghost story.
I have to agree, because multiple eyewitnesses describing the same thing, it's a little harder to rationalize away. And
right.
And again, it's not like Johnny Cash, aside from being well known, for his honesty and everything, it's not something he really had a reason to lie about.
Yes. And if you look at, again, what we talked about earlier is this the spiritual affinity that musicians seems to have,
Hmm.
and Johnny Cash definitely had it. So he was open about it, but he was also honest. Uh, Johnny Cash didn't. Some of these artists, I'm more sort of shocked at how kind of pinpoint they are about these accounts. It's not like Johnny Cash was seeing, if someone was hallucinating quite a bit,
Hmm.
and perhaps Johnny Cash was, as we know a little bit about his past, but
Yeah.
it it doesn't seem to be he was hallucinating all the time and seeing ghosts every. He had these certain experiences that he really felt strongly about, that strongly enough that he was able to come out and write about it or talk to his biographer about it. That to me says something about the honesty of the guy.
I have to agree. It's like this stuck in his head clearly. I mean, he brought it up. He may have had, he may have had other experiences that he was less sure of and he didn't bring up, but there's some reason this stuck in his mind and he said, hey, look, this thing happened to me here in
Right,
front of other people.
right. Yeah, and a lot of the guests that he would have down there also had their own ghost stories, and I'm sure that gave him a little bit of confidence too to talk about
Yeah.
it.
You sound a lot less crazy when other people have had the same experience.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I'm betting you've had this happen with you, but I've had more than once. Half the time when somebody comes up to me and wants to tell me their story, the first thing they say is, "You're gonna think I'm crazy," but
I get that all the time, right? As
it's
soon
like,
as they say, as soon as they say, you think you're going to think I'm crazy, I'm going to say, oh, you're going to have to take a number.
yeah. Well, I'm usually like, because most of what I find it the funniest is I speak pretty regularly about demonology. It's like, okay, you come up to me after I just spent 2 hours talking about ghosts and demons and things like that, but you still think I'm gonna think you're crazy.
Yeah.
Really?
Right. Right.
Especially, and again, I'm sure you've had this experience too. Most of the time, I'd say at least 90% of the time, whatever comes after you think I'm gonna think I'm crazy is not
Hmm.
that bizarre, at least by my standards.
Yeah. After writing these last three books, it would be hard. I would be hard pressed to find someone who is going to come up with something that I would truly label as crazy.
You know,
What?
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I've had I have people that will come up to me, they'll explain something, or they'll email me and ask me to investigate their house, and they'll tell me what's going on, and I'll go, maybe you need to talk to somebody else, but it's not.
Hmm.
Again, it's not necessarily that they're crazy. And again, most of the time, even then, it's not that the phenomenon. I don't believe the phenomenon that they're describing didn't happen. In fact, I can't think of a single time I've ever had somebody say something happened to me and I thought they were hallucinating. What I usually think is, no. There's another explanation for what's happening,
Right.
but it
Well,
did
I
happen.
I agree. And after writing several of these books, there there are just like believers, total believers will label the raccoon in the basement a poltergeist just out of the
Hmm.
gate.
Yeah,
Skeptics will always label a UFO as swamp gas, even when meteorologically it's impossible. That doesn't matter. Science doesn't matter at that point. They
yeah,
just say it was. They want to believe that it was something else, and so likewise,
exactly.
hallucination is just skeptic speak for I don't have an explanation.
Yeah, or
You know,
hallucination or lying because I can't think of another way to explain it.
right? Because I've often wondered what it would take to prove a ghost exists. A lot of the paranormal researchers I talk to have what they would say is evidence, and then the skeptics, the guys that I hang
Yeah,
out with on a daily basis, could easily fall back on it's a hallucination. Like if you
hoax,
saw
hallucination.
right, if you saw a ghost come in, if a ghost came into their house or room and said hello and took up a seat and chatted with them, they would say it was a hallucination. And so, the fascinating thing for this is, I don't think we're ever going to know. And that's what makes this kind of so cool to write about.
I agree, and it's kind of the thing. Because skeptics are always telling me, "Oh, you can't be objective because you believe." And I agree that I have a bias. I'm not going to deny that.
Mm-hmm.
It's human nature. Everyone has a bias. The
Right.
problem I see is that the skeptics also have a bias. As you're saying, they're going to dismiss it as a hallucination just because the possibility that something actually exists isn't in their worldview.
Right.
So they're always going to fall back. And don't get me wrong, there are exceptions to this rule. There are skeptical people that are willing to accept the possibility. But there are also there are skeptics that are just another flavor of believer that if the devil appeared before them and did a tap dance on live video in front of 100 witnesses, they'd still dismiss it.
Yeah, CGI.
Yeah.
That's what they would say.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, as I write these books, and I try to be as close to be, and I have my own biases too, of course, but I try to be open-minded about it and try to get, in the best journalistic sense, everybody's voice in there as possible. But I do come across, those two parallel paths. They're people that are actually so much alike. It's really uncanny that you have the absolute believers in the paranormal and the absolute non-believers in the paranormal, and they're actually very similar.
Oh yes,
it's kind of weird.
And it's a point I've made. Usually, and they never like it, but it's a point I've made to a number of atheists over the years. It's like, there are many decent, nice atheists out there that I get along with just fine. But there is a brand of atheist out there that's really not that you change the rhetoric a little, and they sound like a Bible thumper.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. You have militants on both sides.
Yeah.
Which is, this is a weird story to tell, but I trust me, I have a point. When I started out as a DJ on radio, at one point, I moved to a radio station that was country that was going to turn to rock and roll. So at a certain point, we decided, or the management decided, I don't want to take ownership of this decision, but the management decided to be country in the morning and rock and roll in the afternoon and in the evening. And the logic behind that seems pretty solid. The people that love country will listen in the morning, and the people who love rock and roll tune in at night. What actually happened is everybody hated us, So when I approach this the way I do, I tend to get a lot of flack from both sides, and it's actually kind of fascinating for me.
I know that position well. Nobody is more hated than the guy standing in the middle.
Right. I'm a research writer, and as soon as I say that to somebody that I'm interviewing about their paranormal experience, I'm sure that clams them up, because they think I'm going to, kind of rip them apart. But what I have found is in both camps, I find researchers who are very earnest and honest about what they're doing and really trying to find the truth. And I look at it as science is really at its base a knowledge an algorithm for finding new knowledge and new truth. And I think spirituality, in a lot of ways too, is just a way, an algorithm to find truth on a different sense. Now, I don't think anyone in the spiritual field is going to come up with the internal combustion engine.
No, probably not. Although,
you might get there.
Well, no, there are a number of very good scientists who have gone into explorations of the paranormal as well.
Absolutely.
Alexander Graham Bell was among other things, tried to create a device to communicate with the dead.
Right, and Tesla.
He invented the telephone, and good Lord, Tesla and all of his things. And I'm blanking on examples, but there are examples of somebody trying to make a device with a paranormal purpose that came up with something else that was useful.
Mm-hmm. And I honestly, if you look at some of the quantum physicists, they have kind of stumbled into spirituality, because I think,
yes.
From people like Schrödinger, when you read his stuff, is like reading something out of the Vedas. Albert
Mm-hmm.
Einstein. My own kind of philosophy is more towards idealism too.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm anymore getting more skeptical about materialism providing good answers for some of these experiences. That these
Especially,
experiences exist, is troublesome for that.
I agree, especially when you look at quantum physics and how weird it gets, and how
Right.
fundamentally bizarre our universe really seems to operate. And
Exactly. Yeah.
the other thing that always kills me, and this is another thing I like to bring up with the die-hard skeptics and tends to drive them up the walls. If you look at the principles in quantum physics,
Mm-hmm.
magicians and occultists have been saying these things for hundreds of
Mm-hmm.
years.
Right.
The whole
Or in the
spooky action at a distance concept. Yeah, welcome to Magic 101.
Right. Well, what I find fascinating is, I can be with my friends who are scientists, and they can say without, blinking about parallel universes and black holes where light can't even escape, and dozens and entanglement and all these other
Mm-hmm.
things, and then you say someone saw what they thought was a ghost, and immediately they're like, "No, that's wrong. That's weird." And I'm thinking, well, light being unable to escape is kind of weird too.
And it's
You know,
also,
so
there's quantum theories of consciousness, and just the simple reality of we don't understand what consciousness is.
right.
Good science, good scientists admit, okay, we're pretty sure consciousness exists, but
Hmm.
what it is, what creates it, we don't know. And
Absolutely.
well, I'm not saying we shouldn't explore that topic. Certainly, I don't believe that they're sacred cows. I think, in the sense that I don't believe that there's anything science shouldn't question. Because I think, and the same thing goes for philosophy, because I think it's a good thing to ask the questions. And sometimes, even if you never find the answer, you're still going to learn something of value.
Right.
Which is why I say today, I don't think there's any area science shouldn't explore. There shouldn't be here there be dragons, go no further for the
Well,
scientific
that
thought.
I would say is the essence
Mhm.
of science.
Yeah, I agree.
But
And the problem I have with skepticism and why I think in reality, the diehard skeptics, the ones, Randy or Penn and Teller, the problem that they have is they're so willing to dismiss the possibility that they're wrong. They're overlooking the fact that sometimes they find evidence, because there are some very good studies that, psychic phenomenon in particular gets a lot of flack from skeptics. And
mhm,
supposedly all the studies that have been done of psychic phenomenon have been poorly designed. It's like, no, no, no. There are some well-designed studies that
absolutely.
suggest something is going on.
Hmm.
It doesn't prove that psychic phenomenon exists, but there's enough there to go, okay, there's something going on here that's worth looking into, and dismissing
Hmm.
it outright is terrible, I think.
Right. Well, I would say there's probably more evidence that exists right now, more
Yeah.
scientific evidence for something like telepathy than there is for string theory, and yet, if you're in scientific circles, you can talk about string theory, but you could never talk about telepathy.
Which is, again, is ironic, because it's like, no, if you look at, because one of the arguments I've heard made is that, for telepathy or something like that to exist, our understanding in the universe has to change. And it's like,
Right.
it really doesn't, because there are theories within quantum physics that would account for a lot of psychic phenomenon
Hmm.
completely. And what the response they'll always give me is, well, that's the quantum level of reality. The quantum level of reality doesn't affect the larger universe, which we know isn't true.
Hmm.
Because, and it's an interesting thing, because they'll say that. It's like, well, one doesn't affect the other. It's like, okay, so the photon, the particle slash wave that makes up light, is a quantum level particle. It's not something on the macro universe scale at all.
Hmm.
But the human retina, which is not a quantum level thing, can detect a single photon. That doesn't that kind of throw into question your idea that there's some line dividing the two sides of reality?
Yeah, yeah, that definitely comes up, and when you going back to the point where you say that, you know, the, then the what we know about the universe must change, but look at the history of science. That happens all the time,
Oh yeah,
and it's not really the universe that's changing. It's really just the worldview that would be changing, and so science is an effort to try to get deeper and deeper into the truth.
hmm
But if all of a sudden you say this is the truth and that's about as far as we're going, then science is no longer relevant to you.
it's
Which,
dogma.
right,
It's not
it's
science.
dogma.
It's dogma.
Right.
And while I have no problem with religion, it's like no dogma where you go, this cannot be questioned in anything, in my opinion, is a bad idea, even from a scriptural perspective. As a Christian, it's like, no. Jesus never turned away people who wanted to ask him an honest question.
Hmm.
So religious people should, in my opinion, should be open to questions, and scientific people should be open to questions. We
Sure.
don't, and sometimes they're just not. It's like, no, you can't challenge. We know this is the way the world works. You cannot challenge this, or you will be ridiculed if you challenge this. And ironically, it's something I read in a book a couple of years back, that we keep running into this situation where scientists have become convinced that we more or less understand how the universe works. There's a few
Hmm.
more details out there. It's not the big picture we're working on anymore. We're just filling in all those little details here and there that we don't get. And we've had this, we're starting to reach this point now. And we've had this several times in the past. And every time we reach this point, something huge comes along and throws everything out of whack.
Yeah. I mean, that certainly explains the situation between before Einstein's
Yeah.
relativity and before quantum physics, where I think they had basically had everything figured out besides maybe I think it was black body radiation. And once we
Mm-hmm.
figured that out, well, that opened up the whole world of quantum physics. It opened up entanglement, spooky action at a
Mm-hmm.
distance, all of that, which is really now where we're at now, where we have these two sort of um, vast ways of approaching the universe, the very big in Einstein's relativity and the really small in quantum physics. And
Mm-hmm.
we're having a hard time. I think scientists are having a hard time trying to piece together a theory that fits them all, which to me means maybe you don't have the right idea at all on either, right?
Yeah, I
So
agree.
I think that's going to be something to watch for in the next 20, 30 years to see how that goes, because I'm starting to think we all sit here, and you and I and the scientists who are looking at quantum physics, and say the universe is just weird.
Yeah,
And
it is.
you know, my point is the universe is just fine. We're the weird ones. We're not. Maybe that's the key.
Or maybe God's just screwing with us. Just
Hmm.
every time we think we get complacent, he just starts screwing with shit to make our lives more interesting.
Yeah, that's certainly the trickster aspect of it.
Well, there's one of my favorite examples, and I've been using this a lot lately when I speak with with the more hard-headed atheists and skeptics. The really good example of a theory that just came along and shook up the scientific community, aside from relativity, which did it beautifully, is the Big Bang.
Hmm.
Because prior to the Big Bang, everyone just assumed that the universe was in a steady state. It was the way it was. It's always been the way it was. It will always be the way it was. There is no change.
Hmm.
And when Monsignor Georges Lemaitre comes forward and says, "Okay, the Big Bang no, there was a Big Bang. There's an actual beginning to the universe. It hasn't always existed the way that it is." The scientists went crazy. I mean, Albert Einstein himself, whose own theories of relativity suggested the universe was changing,
Hmm.
said to him, your science and math is fine, but your theory is completely off. He just couldn't
Right.
accept this idea that he was wrong. And
Right.
and these were, and nobody's. I don't think anyone out there is going to say Einstein was a bad scientist, but his own worldview just limited him.
Well, yeah, and I guess where I find some frightening aspects of, to be honest with you, the researchers I work with are not this way, but you do have these hardcore
Yeah.
scientists who think, like, I believe science is a great thing,
Hmm.
but it's not infallible. Einstein, the smartest of the smart, they're still human. They're still struggling with
Yeah.
the same things that we do. To give them this, kind of give them
It's
Einstein was
almost a
wrong.
religious
Yeah, yeah,
reverence.
yeah, and I kind of my approach is that's the exact opposite thing that you need to have here. To find the truth, you've got to throw everything out and really start looking.
And if you look at what Einstein said or what Hawking says, they don't want to be on that pedestal. They want
Mm-hmm.
it's like they recognize that somebody. The way I always put it is science is only as good as its next theory.
Mm-hmm.
Any theory you have is only as good as until somebody comes up with something better. And and even the more hard-headed, and there are many. It's not, it feels like I'm dumping a little on science. I want to say I think the majority of scientists are not like this because
I
most
agree.
scientists I know and most scientists I've had the pleasure of interacting with, are fascinated, are excited when something comes and shakes up everything they assume they know. And I think most scientists, that's why they get into this, is just to be able to find new things out about the universe and realize things that we're so sure we know are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that mindset. It's that dogmatic. This is right. Einstein said it. It must be true. Einstein admitted he made mistakes.
Yeah,
We know
some big
Some
ones.
of Einstein's big mistakes.
Right. The in the I would say after writing these books, you know, two of the biggest questions I get are, did you ever experience? Did you ever see a ghost? Is usually how
Yeah, I
they
was
say
going to
it.
ask you that at some point.
Right. And the other thing that I get a lot is, do you believe in this stuff?
Yeah.
Especially when people find out that I'm a science writer.
Hmm.
And I had one interesting encounter, or just maybe even more than one, because this kind of crops up. And what I my advice, and this isn't in my advice, if you do come to some of these kind of hardcore scientists, take them out drinking,
I like that idea.
because
Get a
I was
drunk.
at yeah because I was at a conference, and it did come up at this table that I had just written, this haunted rock and roll, and
Hmm.
they were in good natured joking around with me. And then as the evening wore on, they started, as a couple of these guys that were hardcore, materialists
Yeah.
and skeptics, started to tell stories that were, I could have used in the book.
I'm
Uh,
not surprised. I've
that
been down this road before.
it just was, to me, it was really fascinating, because I was able to, sort of step back and say, these guys have experienced the same thing that another person has, but because they're biased this way, they uh, they interpret what they saw as within their worldview,
Hmm.
whereas someone who is open to it is going to interpret it in another worldview, and I find that fascinating.
So you have, now that I think about it, you sort of have answered the question. But have you? But so let me rephrase it. Since
Hmm.
you've said you've had some weird experiences, but not
Hmm.
necessarily anything paranormal, have you had any weird experiences specifically related to country music?
No. Well, when I visited Memphis,
Hmm.
um, and I went to, and first of all, just being in Memphis and being in Graceland,
Yeah.
if I did see the ghost of Elvis Presley, it wouldn't have shocked me because the spirit is there. There's
Oh
something
yeah.
about that place. But when I was in Sun Studios, and the tour guide took us to the center of the studio and by the mic, and they started to play. I think it was "I Walk the Line."
Hmm.
I just had an absolute chill go through my body that I normally wouldn't have had, and I put that in with the weird experiences. Now, sadly, I looked into the ghost stories of Sun Studios, and I didn't find any at that point. But recently, I've had some leads about Sun Studio being haunted, so maybe I'll look into that for a sequel. So so that was really kind of a country, and I've been in the Ryman, and I've felt things, but feeling something doesn't really rise to the level of a good
It's not the same as seeing Elvis come out and go, thank you very much."
yeah, yeah, exactly. Oh, boo, man. Uh, but I am honest that the closest I've ever come to sort of like a paranormal experience is besides a Grateful Dead concert. That's a different story. But I did live in this apartment in my hometown for about a year, and throughout that year, I experienced several weird, anomalous events. At one point, there were like 4 or 5 interior doors in this apartment that I always had open so that I could go from room to room. Uh, One night, I went to bed, all the doors were open. The next morning, they were all shut. Um, then there was one time I was at the kitchen, probably about 30, 40 feet from the television set, and the television turned on all by itself. And there's some other ones. One was that my wife, now my girlfriend at the time,
Hmm.
was in the living room trying to find her earring.
Hmm.
She had it in her ear, and all of a sudden it fell out or almost disappeared. And prior to this, I had said to her, kind of joking around, that this place is haunted, and she doesn't like you. And I said and I
Hmm.
was just trying to freak her out. But in any event, this earring just literally disappeared. And as she was getting ready to go, I gave her a bag. I think I had a bag of cookies in a sleeve.
Hmm.
And the sleeve was faced the opposite direction of where we were standing, a good, I want to say 6 or 7 feet across the room.
Hmm.
She found her earring in
In the
that
sleeve.
bag, yeah, in the sleeve, which, honestly, so as a skeptic, I go through and I say, well, there's a chance that I slept walk and
Closed all of the doors.
closed the doors. I've never, I don't sleepwalk. I haven't since then. So that's weird. The apartment itself was an old house with a series of apartments in it. So there's a very good chance that someone with a remote, infrared hits off a window, bounces into my television, turns it on. That that could happen. It didn't happen again. Didn't happen before that. But I'm willing to say that you know
There's a possibility.
there's a possibility. So I've gone through all of those different things,
But
and
what
with
about the
my
earring?
it would have been a hell of a shot. That's all I can say. Michael
Because
Jordan couldn't have made it.
I have to say, realistically, um, and respectfully, but when you put the three of them together, your apartment
Right.
was haunted.
Well, and here's the kicker. So probably this was 10 years ago.
Hmm.
I think it was maybe last year or the year before. I was on Facebook, and a friend of mine made a post and said something like, "Oh, uh, my friend was here again yesterday. She and did something, started to talk about this apartment that he was living in was haunted, and he was convinced of it. So I reached out to him, and he said, "I'm living," and gave the address of the apartment
Hmm.
that I lived in, and then proceeded to tell me almost the exact same activity that I was experiencing on a regular basis there. That to me that almost stretches the imagination that it wasn't anything but something super freaky because he had uh, alarm clocks turn on and off. He had radios turn on and off. And the weirdest thing for me was that he considered the spirit female, and for some reason, and I can't even really remember why, I kind of felt like it was a female presence as well. Later, we found that. In fact, I probably knew this at the time. I didn't want to make it sound, maybe it just crystallized that
Hmm.
it was a doctor's office at one point, and it was a baby doctor's
Oh
office.
boy.
Yeah, yeah. So that's why I have a lot of respect for people who come forward and tell me their stories. And I usually do tell them that story to make them feel more comfortable. That hey, I've had things happen to me too.
I will say, by the way, honestly, from experience, get used to the whole. Are you serious? Do you believe in all this stuff? I go to conventions, tell people publicly I'm a demonologist, hand out business cards, lecture on the subject, and still have people come up to me and go, "So do you really believe all of that? Like, really?
Yeah,
You
I got the business card.
just heard me speak for 2 hours. Yeah, I actually believe all that. Is this really that shock? That question is way back a year, over a year now. When I first got started doing this, we did a frequently asked questions video. That's one of my most frequently asked questions.
Wow, wow. Yeah, yeah. I get it quite a bit.
With you, it makes more. You're a researcher, and especially when you're
Hmm.
reporting the stories more than necessarily making judgments. It makes a little more sense. Just
Right.
because I've met folklorists and other people who report the stories but don't believe in them. They just report them for this folkloric cultural value that the story
Sure.
has.
Sure.
But yeah, it's not a question you're ever gonna run short on. And again, that mindset you have of the open-minded skepticism, I think, is incredibly healthy. I mean, my co-host, who is currently in law school, which is why he's not with us tonight, but he has that same sort. He's had experiences, so
Hmm.
it's not that he doesn't believe, but there's still that. We investigated a house, and it's like, well, okay, you're having some problems, mold here, you're having all these other problems, and he wasn't necessarily dismissing that the house was haunted, but it's like, well, there's some other things here you need to look at
Hmm.
because, and there's a great story my mentor had of doing a case in Rhode Island where a man was possessed. I mean, he was possessed by a demon. There's no way around that. But the guy was also nuts.
Mm.
He was just completely off the wall out there. But there was clearly something. There was actually something in his house. He was just because Lou and the other investigator he was with saw things happen in that house you can't explain. So clearly it's
Hmm.
not just his insanity. But the guy was the head of microbiology for a big university. He kept charts on the wall every day. Whenever he had like lunch or dinner or any
Hmm.
meal, he'd write down what he ate and the exact molecular composition. It's
Wow.
kind of cool to be that smart and be able to do that, but it's really quite obsessive.
Yeah, I'll say.
And to just hang that on your wall.
Yeah.
So it's like it could be one, it could be the other, it could be and why not both?
Right. Well, and I guess the thing is that bugs me the most about dogma. Let's throw. Who cares about truth and finding and discovering
Yeah.
stuff? It's just really boring, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and so, what I find that drives a good story is always the tension. that exists in the narrative. And it just so happens when you're writing what I write is the main tension that you have is this real? And luckily you have all kinds of voices who say it is and all kinds of voices who say it is not. And so what is the easiest tact for me as a storyteller is to give both sides of those and really let the reader you know,
Make their own
find out for
conclusions.
themselves, or maybe not come up with their own conclusions, but be able to ask all those questions themselves.
No, which is good. That's sort of I like to see those sorts of books in this field because even from being a believer, even for people I respect, sometimes it's just tiring to read. The
Yeah,
truth is out there.
yeah,
The truth is out there. It's like what rely on people's own intelligence to ask questions
hmm
and be curious and inquisitive. And I think it's just a healthier way to write.
right.
So I have bringing us back to the books.
hmm
Um, so out of curiosity, across the three books you've written so far, do you have what would you consider the weirdest story?
I would have to say the weirdest story comes from Haunted Rock and Roll, and one thing that I've been asked is there a difference between rock and roll and country music as far as ghosts and ghost lore, and there really is a difference in that haunted rock and roll seems to be more of an outsider's art, and by that I mean people who tend to be attracted from it come to it from outside of the mainstream, whether it's Elvis, who is from basically a ghetto outside of Memphis, or
Yeah.
the Beatles in Liverpool, or the punk scene in New York. You have people who tend to come out of the socioeconomic mainstream, the cultural mainstream, and so they are more. I'm generalizing, of course, but they seem to be more willing to embrace uh, alternative spirituality, things
Mm-hmm.
like occultism, Celtic mythology, shamanism in the case of the Doors. So rock and roll's ghost stories tend to have more of an edge. I mean, you don't see Johnny Cash cavorting with Aleister Crowley,
No, not usually.
So, but what you do have is stories. For me, the weirdest ones come from the haunted rock and roll genre, especially the one that I write about in the book is about Aleister Crowley's house, which was called Bulliskin House. I think it burned down recently, but there was one story in particular that kind of fascinated me, and there were numerous. Aleister Crowley bought this house because he said it was the darkest house he has ever seen, and it was dark even on the brightest days of summer, and it helped him with his spell casting apparently.
You're
But
right.
there
It
were
did apparently suffer, according to the Wikipedia, it suffered significant fire damage in 2015.
Okay, okay. And when I wrote it, it was up and running, and um, what a few of the stories that came out, the one that I thought that really struck me was that uh, Jimmy Page was so Aleister Crowley lived there, and then Jimmy
Mm-hmm.
Page bought it, and he was fascinated by Crowley and magic, and he bought the house, and of course, when you're a rock star and you see ghosts, the skeptic, the skeptical approach to that is they're probably
What were you high
higher.
on?
Right, exactly. So he must have gotten that quite a few at times, and he was talking to a Rolling Stone reporter, and the Rolling Stone reporter um, asked him, basically he said, well, all these people are stoned or they're drunk, a lot of these witnesses that he mentioned had seen things in his house. And Jimmy Page said, well, wait a minute, I have a friend and he was completely sober and he is straight. He doesn't do drugs or alcohol. He stayed over one night in the house. And, late at night and early into the morning, he kept hearing this rumpling outside of his room,
Hmm.
And so the next morning, he went to the caretaker and told the caretaker, "Hey, tonight, if you could just let the cats out because they were bugging me. They were, you know, wrestling around outside of the hall." And the caretaker said, "Well, the cats were in my room all night, so it definitely wasn't that." And, this guy wondered what it was. And the caretaker said, "Well, here's the story," and proceeded to tell him that one of the legends of Bulliskin House is that a person was decapitated there,
Oh my.
and the decapitated head rolled down the hall outside of this fella's
That hole.
room. And the cool part was the reporter then says to Jimmy Page, "So have you heard the sound of this head rolling down the hall?" And Jimmy Page said, "No, I've never heard that." And so then the reporter says, "Well, okay, so you don't believe any of this?" And Jimmy Page said, "I didn't say that. I said that
You
I
said you
didn't
hadn't
hear
heard
it.
it. Yeah.
I didn't hear it." So I thought that was kind of cool and kind of weird. There are some stories there again of several people in the one room who claim to have seen a painting levitate off the wall and slowly go to the ground. Um,
It was owned
so
by Aleister Crowley. There's nothing you can tell me about that house that would surprise me, especially since
yeah,
it's also on Loch freaking Ness.
yeah, that's the other thing I should have brought up. Yeah, yeah, just it had a lot of. Yeah, I just always wonder about the blessed feeling the realtor must have gotten when he found out or she found out that Jimmy Page was interested in the house,
You just hear the cha-ching.
Yeah, because if you would have told me, pulled me up to the house and said, "Oh, here's a house, a little story. Aleister Crowley used to live here, and it's by the Loch Ness," I would have said, "Oh, thanks, I'm
Moving
out of
on.
here." Yeah, is there a nice Cape Cod somewhere far away from here?
You know, then again, it's Scotland. Good luck finding a house in Scotland that isn't haunted.
That's true too. Yeah,
Good luck finding a house anywhere in the British Isles that isn't haunted, actually.
right. A lot of history there.
Yeah. I seem to recall from when I was a kid, there's actually a ghost story from Scotland. And just to show how different it is over there, it's a ghost story about a house that doesn't have a ghost. But wow, I hadn't known that about the house being owned by the guy from the Doors, because I've heard Moleskin House before, of course, because oddly
Hmm.
enough, when you specialize in demonology, you learn a thing or two about Aleister Crowley.
Hmm.
And in fact, I really am overdue to do an episode about him. Just because he's such
Yeah,
it's like, no, I have to do an entire episode on Crowley. He's too interesting.
yeah,
He's just too fascinating a figure to skip.
yeah. I actually just was reading. I don't know whether you've ever read Colin Wilson. He
Once
ha-
or twice, I
he has
think.
he has a book called The Occult, and he goes into Crowley's life pretty far in depth. I didn't know a lot about him
Mm,
when I wrote about it, but through that
yeah.
research and later have found out more and more about him, and yeah, just and Jimmy Page is from Led Zeppelin, of
Hmm.
course. Um,
Or yeah, I'm sorry, I
so
said the Doors.
yeah,
I
that's
just looked it
okay.
up. How did I screw that up?
Yeah, that's okay. But there are a lot of ghost stories about the Doors too, specifically Jim Morrison.
Mm, not from what I know of I'm not as big. I like rock music fine. I'm just not quite the fan of it I am of country. But
Uh-huh.
from what I know, yeah, that doesn't surprise me about Jim Morrison.
Yeah,
Or,
Jim Morrison is really the only. There are a lot of rock stars who claim to have seen ghosts, and
mhm.
Jim Morrison. And then there are a lot of rock stars who became ghosts, but Jim Morrison's the only one who said he was a ghost because he said he was driving through the Southwest with his family when he was a kid. He was a Navy brat and was going from
Mhm.
base to base, and they came across a accident involving some Native Americans. And he claims that as they passed, the two of the Native American spirits entered his soul, and that explains his interest in shamanism, and especially if you go to any, you see any Doors concert footage, there is a very shamanistic quality about it.
Well, this just occurs to me, and I looked it up to double check because I don't remember all of them. But Morrison's part of the 27 Club.
Yeah, yeah, he sure is.
Did you get into the 27 Club much in your books?
I wrote a chapter about it. Gary Patterson, in his book Walk on the Dark Side, does a really fascinating job. I think he may have been the guy who coined the 27 Club. But the 27 Club starts with Robert Johnson, technically, who died at 27 mysteriously, and goes the whole way up to Kurt Cobain and Amy Winehouse.
Yeah, I'm looking right now at a list on in Wikipedia, not the greatest source granted, but and it's a list of all the various people that fit into the 27 Club supposedly curse.
Right.
It's a long list of a lot of very prominent people.
Yeah, it really is. And I tried to get, in the chapter I wrote, I kind of got into the geeky, researchy part of it, which was, I'd say about 10 years ago, some researchers wanted to find out if statistically the age of 27 is a dangerous time for rock stars. And they concluded that it wasn't significant, that any age was your probability of dying as a rock star was equal. But like I like to break down the numbers, so I looked into their numbers, and they used, and I hope I'm getting this right because it was a while since I wrote this, but I think they said that to be included in the list, you had to have a number one on the UK pop charts from 1950 to whenever. So some things stood out to me right away. Number one was the rock and roll era really doesn't start till 56, let's say, and even later in the UK because they were a little behind us. So that's almost a decade of those numbers that are going to be whacked. And the other thing is, a lot of the rock stars never made it to number one on the British charts, but would still be considered rock stars. So I don't think Jim Morrison, The Doors made it. I don't think Janis Joplin made it to number one. They might have been on the charts, but not number one.
Well, one of the those greatest people, the most famous person on the list, the first one, Robert Johnson died in 1938.
38.
And that's a little bit before that cutoff period.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's all kinds of strangeness involved with those numbers that almost border on cherry picking.
It seems like it. It's like, and it's also a problem you're running into. It's like, how exactly are you defining rocks? That's one seems to me somewhat arbitrary way to define someone as a rock star.
Yeah. I mean, people like Pigpen from the Grateful Dead died at 27, and I mean, he would have never been included on this list.
But he's on this list of the people that are on the 27 Club.
Right.
So do you think there's anything to it? And if you do, what do you think's the cause?
Well, when I wrote the chapter, one of the things I looked at was numerology, whether the number 27 had anything special about it. And I quite unconvincingly found some information that, if you add the 2 and the 7, you get 9, and 9 is the number of poets and artists, apparently, according to some numerologists. So there is that aspect of it. Looking at it realistically, I would say that if these rock stars come into fame and fortune relatively young, in their mid-20s or early 20s, chances are that drugs and alcohol and all the other kinds of self-indulgences would catch up to you within a few years. So that that definitely, I think, plays a role for it. Um, the other aspect of this is, you know, Robert Johnson as the initiator of rock and roll, the
Yeah.
grandfather of rock and roll. Uh, the legend is that that number is cursed, and that goes back to the Crossroads curse.
Yes,
So that
and
these,
his deal with the
you know,
devil.
and his deal with the devil. So there again, you have this fascinating example of one kind of uh, number that inspires all this different folklore and speculation. But I know I'm straddling a lot of fences here,
No,
but
that's good. I'm not trying
I
to pin
I'm
you down to a single
right.
definitive decision.
I'm not convinced one way or the other that there is anything special about the 27 Club.
Fair enough. So we've circled around it. Let's talk a little bit about Johnson himself.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the story? Or do you want to start maybe
I
by telling the story for the one guy listening to this that doesn't know?
Yeah, I love the story. The story about Robert Johnson is that Robert Johnson was, African American in the Mississippi Delta at that time, had pretty much two options. You either work in the field as a field hand, or you become a musician, a blues musician. And trust me, the fringe benefits of being a blues musician at the time probably far outweighed being a field hand at the time.
Yeah.
Blues musicians, and you got to understand that the Mississippi Delta is really the cradle of great blues music, and
No
to get
question.
into to get into that circle requires immense talent, to say the least. And that's kind of where Robert Johnson uh, failed a little, because he was described at best as mediocre, and uh, to the more honest bluesmen, they just thought he was terrible,
Yeah.
and and he was very annoying. He was always following them around. There was one blues musician in particular called his name was Son House, and the kind of cool thing about researching about Robert Johnson is that he's a historical figure, and uh, the people who knew him talked about him, and even into the late 80s and 90s, we were still getting actual historical accounts of this. So a lot of the
Beautiful.
historical accounts are legitimate. But Son House basically said that he was tired of Robert Johnson showing up at his gigs, and trying to always get tips and new licks from him. And apparently the circle of blues musician kind of got hostile to him. And for whatever reason, whether they bullied him out of the circle or he left on his own, he simply disappears from the historical record for just about a year exactly. The story that I heard, one of the stories I heard was that a year to the date that they kind of kicked him out, Son House is playing at a roadhouse, and as he's playing, his band takes a break, and they go outside to smoke and have a drink. And from inside the hall, they hear this amazing blues music, and they go in back into the hall, and they see that Robert Johnson is playing the guitar. And not only is he playing, solid blues, but he has kind of come up with his own style. And for the next 2 or 3 years, he dominates the scene. Some of the songs that he records there allude to his deal with the devil, but it doesn't take long for these blues musicians and some of the people in the area who, this idea of going to the crossroads at midnight and waiting for a man in black to show up, and he gives you a contract, you sign it, and then he restrings your guitar, tunes your guitar, and sends you on your way. And this is what they said happened to Robert Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Johnson is a phenomenal success in that area. Those recordings are, as I said, among the best.
He's
Uh,
considered one of the greatest guitarists in human history.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I would say rightfully so.
Oh,
But
I
then,
agree completely.
yeah, but then a few years later, he dies mysteriously and painfully. They said he was, howling at the top of his lungs in such pain. A lot of stories, said that he was killed by his girlfriend. Some said he was killed by his girlfriend's husband.
Yeah, that's the
And
one I've
then
usually heard.
Yeah, and then the other one, of course, is that the devil came back
The
to
deal came due.
the deal came due, and so the rest is history.
There's legends
What
as
I
well that he had seen things. He was hallucinating before he died as well, I believe.
Right, 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 and he had that song "Hellhound on My Trail,"
Great song.
uh, and he's howling like a hellhound before
Yeah.
he dies. So he kind of knew about the legend too, and did a lot to further it. In my opinion, what I found is that a lot of ghost hunters in the area do come up with a lot of paranormal phenomena there. The soil itself is reportedly cursed. I
Mm-hmm.
found that after I wrote the book.
Hmm.
Um, so there's that. All of those. There's a whole paranormal side to it. What I kind of find fascinating now, stepping back and thinking about it and looking into it, is Robert Johnson's deal at the Crossroads becomes to me an artistic journey for just about all of the rock stars that follow.
Mm-hmm.
In this way, you have someone who is not accepted by the mainstream, who's kind of kicked out, and they have to develop their own sound and their own style and their own kind of belief and their own approaches to music. And then they're brought back in, and they end up with this new style ends up being even more popular than the former style,
Yeah.
which happens over and over in rock history. And then, they get complacent, the drugs and the alcohol, and then especially what I would consider the biggest devils in music history, the guys with the suits show up with the contracts, and they kind of do quote unquote sell their soul to become popular and to get all the wine, women, and songs. So
Yeah.
to me, the story becomes much more about an artist's journey than it does about the paranormal aspect.
And it's the thing we've been saying, and I think is very true here, is there's value in the myth whether it happened or not.
Absolutely.
And as you're
It,
saying, the myth is very allegorical for the journey from the Mr. No Name who can barely hold the guitar properly to one of the certainly one of the top 5, if not higher, greatest guitarists ever.
Mhm. Right. Uh, the other thing I found out was that in America we have the crossroads, but in England they have bridges, and one of those bridges is very close to John Lennon's house. And that story is the devil shows up on this bridge
Mm-hmm.
and has a contract and offers you 10 years of success for your soul. And according to the legend in Liverpool, John Lennon made that deal
I did not know
back
that
in.
about John Lennon.
Yeah, yeah. So that was, I think they said that was, I forget exactly what year they said that is, but they backtrack. Or I'm sorry, I think it's 20 years of fame and success before the contract is due. But whatever the number was, it ends up right when the Beatles blow up to when John was assassinated in 1980, I think.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, 1960 to 80.
Because I want to, yeah. And no, it's interesting because when you look at the Crossroads story with Johnson, from there's a theory a folklorist has put forward that I find interesting, that maybe he made a deal in a sense, or at least he did some kind of ritual
Mm-hmm.
that was supposed to be the equivalent of a deal, but he didn't make it with the devil. Because there's a figure in voodoo, which is of course very prominent in the South, and was certainly in Johnson's time, called Legba. and
Hmm.
Legba is associated with the crossroads, and he's associated with kind of that deal making and that trickster aspect without
Hmm.
actually being malevolent.
Okay.
And
That
being,
name
yeah,
did come up when I researched. Yeah.
it's like I almost have to wonder if maybe there's a kernel of truth in there, because religious prominences of the area and everything else aside, it's not entirely outside of the realm of possibility. He did some kind of offering to a spirit to help
Hmm.
his career, and that's not necessarily to suggest something malevolent behind it. It's just somewhat analogous to praying, saying a prayer or something to that effect, more than
Sure.
actual selling your soul.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That could definitely be it. And then is it Hecate that is the goddess of the
Yes,
crossroads?
she's the Greek goddess of magic, and yes, she's also associated with the crossroads.
So that name also came up a lot. So there's a lot of mythic truth, and for me, someone who loves folklore, it, it's amazing that we're still talking about Hecate and Greek myths because they've become integrated into what I consider modern mythology, which is ghost lore and stories of rock and roll and country music. I should say that I came very close to, when you write about rock and roll, you talk about the crossroads and signing the deal with the devil. That doesn't pop up a lot when you write about the ghosts of country music. But there was a story that I kind of found that Hank Williams's mentor was from I think New Orleans, and there was this vibe that he also sold his soul to the devil. But I just couldn't find enough info about that to really make to add
It's a
that to the
rumor. It's
book.
not something that's concrete enough. I get you.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so I have to ask, as we're coming towards the end of the second hour, and being the country music fan I am, and the fact that I'm sure I have listeners that are fans of this song, just because I know people who don't like country who love this song. So, can you shed any light on any stories related to "The Devil Went Down to Georgia"?
Well, The Devil Went Down to Georgia is really a country music extension of the uh, the Crossroads
Yeah.
story. So I don't even know. Believe it or not, I didn't even really write about it in the
Hmm.
book because, which now, of course, I'm kicking myself for, because it would be interesting to find out whether that was. Did Charlie Daniels invent that, or was that a kind of a common bit of folklore there?
I
See,
read
I don't know.
recently. So I read somewhere recently online. I think while researching a little to prep for our talk,
Hmm.
but that there is that Daniels, when he wrote the song, was drawing on Appalachian folklore, and that there's at least a similar story in the Appalachian region,
Well, that's
or is
kind
it
of
the
interesting.
Ozarks? I can't remember which. But there's that mountainous region, and yeah, there is a similar story.
I did write one of the stories that I wrote about, and I didn't connect it, but it might be connected. There's a there's a place called Fiddler's Rock, and I'm blanking on where it is, but
I've heard of it. I can't remember.
the legend there is that they had problems with snakes, and this fiddle player could calm the snakes by playing the fiddle, and then the people would go kill him. And then one night, and I can't remember exactly the legend how it went, but the
It's in
snakes ended up
Tennessee,
getting him.
Johnson
Is
County,
it
Tennessee.
okay? And so even now, people say that they can hear fiddling coming from down those rocks, or how the wind hits those rocks. It sounds like fiddling. So that might be where he kind of drew on that.
It could be. It's an interesting question. And now that it's like, oh, you haven't didn't look into it. Now you're kind of kicking yourself. It's like I may need to go do some digging because I. It's such a great song,
Yeah.
and I'm curious.
Well, and I have my own belief that usually about 20 minutes after I packed up my manuscript and sent it to the publisher, these stories start coming out, and now the only thing I think in the back of my mind is, well, maybe I'll get a sequel out of this. But it is interesting, and the certainly the motifs of that legend are similar to Robert Johnson's.
Well, it occurs to me if you run into any good ones, particularly good ones, and you're interested, it's been on hiatus for the time being, but I have a sister series to this that I do called Forgotten Fairy Tales, which is all about taking
Mm,
fairy tales and folklore from around the world and just telling the story. Specifically, my goal with it has always been picking stories that people don't know. I don't want to really. I'm probably gonna get to the point where I'll do like the original Brothers Grimm version of Little Red Riding
hmm
Hood, just because of how different it is from the story we all know.
hmm
But I don't. I want to do more like I've done the story of Sun Wukong. I've done the story of Robert Johnson, of course, and I
hmm
pick all these stories that aren't well known, just because, like yourself, I love folklore. Whether it's true or not, I
hmm
don't care. I just love the stories, and I like sharing that interest with other people.
Right.
I do at conventions sometimes as well. I'll do a panel by the same name, and it's just my co-host and I'll just sit. We've done it once so far. We've been too busy with other projects to do it again, but we just sat in a room for an hour and told folklore from all around the
That'd be
world.
great.
Yeah.
I should add that the Bob Dylan on 60 Minutes mentions his own deal at the Crossroads, and I don't know whether he was being serious. Probably wasn't, but that he takes a nod to Robert Johnson is, I think, instructive. But the Bob Dylan was, by most accounts, was yeah, just a mediocre folk singer in a kind of a area where there's a lot of great folk music in Minnesota, and I
Hmm.
think he was going to the University of Minnesota, and then he went away and went to New York City. And when he came back, he was fabulous. He was a great songwriter. He's a great
Well, it's New York, so
guitarist.
obviously he made a deal with the devil up there. It's New York.
That's where you would most likely find him.
Yeah.
The whole place is a crossroads. Absolutely. So it's just interesting that, like you say, that I really love this folklore and how it pops up, and how these artists kind of use it to explain their own careers.
And it's a ready source. I mean, if you want, people have been using it for inspiration for music and movies and TV shows and everything
Hmm.
since these mediums have existed, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, and it's just funny. We talked a little about Slender Man, and on the one hand, it's not quite folklore because it's something that somebody originally started for as fiction. You know,
Hmm.
for a contest, as I understand it. But it kind of has developed from that into an urban legend and into legitimate folklore, just because of the belief and the question, of course, with this idea that some folklorists use of fake lore, things that like Slender Man or Pecos Bill or Paul Bunyan that we know were created for a specific purpose,
Hmm.
as opposed to being a story that people just shared. And it's like, is it easy to make that distinction?
Right.
You know? And I think as
Yeah.
well, there's value in the story whether it happened or not.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, folklore to me, it just every time I go into some of these stories with ghost lore and folklore, I just find so many more nuances and little snippets to pick out, and that to me is kind of the fascinating thing about it.
I agree, and I think you and I are hardly unique in this, just because of the fact there are people still that watch this channel. I think if people didn't find even just the story, because I know I've known they're plenty of skeptics who love horror movies, who love myths and fairy
Hmm.
tales and folklore. And it's like you don't have to believe in it to be interested.
Right.
And of course, the other side of that being how many people I've had. I've had people who come up to me and it's like, I don't believe in ghosts, but my absolute favorite example of which is being in a comic shop and talking to this guy who's like, well, ghosts don't exist. About and he tells me like a year or so ago he was out on the street, main street in town, late at night, and saw a man walking without a head.
Oh my God.
But he doesn't believe in ghosts, and I'm just looking at him like I had no idea what to say to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you could say.
And he wasn't even trying to say it was a hallucination or a dream or he was drunk. He just said he doesn't believe in ghosts, and it happened. And I'm like,
Whatever you got to do to justify it, I guess.
yeah. Or the other great example I've used a few times with people, and it works pretty well. And the late Ed Warren I know used with people. It's like, okay, you don't believe in ghosts? Would you stay overnight alone in a haunted house? And how many
Hmm.
people who swear they don't believe? Hell no.
Yeah, yeah. I know I would.
It's like, where do I see those things on Facebook. It's like, oh, would you stay in this haunted house for a month alone for $1 million? It's like, where do I sign up? I don't even care about the money. Where do I sign up? Okay, I
Yeah.
want the money. I won't. Like I pretend I couldn't use $1 million, but
No, I'm the exact opposite. I'd say no.
I can't blame you there either. But then again,
I would
yeah.
sit. I would sit out in the yard with a recorder and wait for you to come out. Then I would record your experiences and use them in a book. That's my approach.
Nothing wrong with that. Somebody's got to write this stuff down.
Someone's got to do it.
Yeah. And I don't blame. And I'll tell you honestly, I get people all the time who ask me that they want to come out on investigations. And you want to know honestly, my answer most of are you out of your mind?
It, I've been asked several times. People have asked me if I, have gone on investigations, and I never have.
Yeah.
And I always say the hours are really lousy. They're
Yeah.
usually like 2 o'clock in the morning. I've got a lot of other things I want to do besides be out in a creepy house at 2 in the morning. But the other thing that I think about is if I go out on one of these things and I don't experience anything, does
Which
that
is a good chance.
then shape? Yeah, and does that shape how I write about that? If I go out and experience something, does that affect how I write about it? And it probably would,
Yeah.
And then so those are things I think about above and beyond not liking the hours.
There's also realistically, and it's like you from experience, do you really want to sit in a cold, dark cemetery for 3 hours, starting at midnight, waiting for something that you even knowing that stuff exists, probably won't happen?
Yeah, not interested.
I don't blame you. I don't understand why people are interested. So many people are interested. It's like, why does this sound fun to you?
Yeah,
Set aside the ghosts and all the creepy things that can happen. You're going to be cold and wet and miserable,
right,
and nothing may happen.
right, and probably bored.
Oh, yeah. Although it's more fun if you have more than one person, because at least you have somebody to talk to.
That's true.
It's again, it's a thing I stress all the time when I talk about this kind of thing. There are so many things that we do in the field that sometimes people think, oh, there's a weird paranormal reason for that. And 9 times out of 10, there's really logical reasons for that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why do I say never go alone into a location? On the one hand, there's the whole, yeah, there's a lot of dangers that go with going alone, especially into a cemetery or somewhere like that. On the other hand, it gets really, really dull. It's nice to have somebody to talk to once in a while. So, I don't think people think about that logistical side of it.
Right. Yeah, there's meaning in the madness.
Well, let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Because we are coming up on 10.
Okay.
As much fun as this is.
It's been a blast.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate. When I did radio for almost 10 years, we had guests. Some of our guests were out there. Some of them weren't. I've been very blessed so far to have some really good guests. And so, yeah, I'm enjoying this. Sadly, I haven't had the money lately to go pick them up, but I think I am going to have to go pick up the Ghosts of Country Music and probably the rock and roll one too. Just because,
Yeah,
yeah,
I would love for you to look those over, and then we can even chat again.
I'd be happy to. I would be absolutely delighted to have you on again once I get a chance to
Okay.
sit down and dig into these. Um, okay, there at least is one more, maybe a good note to start wrapping up on. You keep saying that you send it to the printer and you find more stuff.
Hmm.
What is the best thing you've found since that you didn't get a chance to incorporate into the book? Do you think?
Well, I just found recently. There's a legend that the Ryman stage is cursed. And on one side of it, they talk about how many people who have played there and who have died later, under
Weird
unfortunate
circumstances.
circumstances. Patsy Cline, Hank Williams, and some of the others.
Hmm.
But then they essentially what happened was the Grand Ole Opry was a radio show that was centered at the Ryman, and then
Hmm.
they moved it because it outgrew the Ryman. They moved it to its own place called Opryland, and when I was writing it, it sounded like the Opryland amusement park was no longer functioning. There was floods and everything like that. But in any event, they moved the Grand Ole Opry out there, and allegedly they took out a few of the boards from uh, the Ryman to create a stage out in Opryland. And from what I've been finding out recently is there are, and I write about it in the book, but I didn't get this connection that
Hmm.
somehow the spirits have transferred to the new location because of them trying to recreate the stage there. So
Hmm.
I may have found that out probably about 2 or 3 weeks after it was getting printed.
Well, as you said, there's always the room for the sequel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am really coming close to the coming up with some material for a sequel to Haunted Rock and Roll.
So, is that what you think is going to be next? The sequel to Haunted Rock and Roll? Do you have it?
Uh,
Anything
I
planned?
Well, the next one I plan on doing, I'm wrapping up right now is I'm looking at some of the ghost lore in the Fortean tales from World War II, and
Oh.
yeah, it's going to go. I'm going to get a little farther out there because World War II has a lot of Foo Fighters, UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of haunted tales from battlefields and also from ships and planes. So that's kind of the next project. But the way this works is while you're wrapping up one,
Mm-hmm.
you're actually gathering material for another, and then you're talking about one that you put. You were essentially like the Ghost of Country Music. I probably finished that about 2 years ago. So. Sometimes I'm sure people are going to stump me on some of these
No,
questions.
World War II is a particular fascination of mine.
Oh, great.
Partly because, so my mother's father was military intelligence. He was in
Okay.
London for the bombs,
Oh, wow.
and my father's father was a gunner on a half track who was there
Oh,
for the
nice.
Battle of the Bulge.
Very
And
cool.
Grandpa Hingle, unfortunately, very modest man. He doesn't necessarily like to talk about his experiences, partly because
Hmm.
he doesn't think they're very interesting. He doesn't think having been there for the bombs coming down is very interesting. Like I said, he's a very modest man. Um, but Grandpa Mears used to love to tell stories of his experiences, and that you can't be interested in ghosts without picking up a lot of history.
Hmm.
But I think that's largely why I find history so fascinating. And World War II in particular, like I know the stories of the Foo Fighters and some of the crazy things that they saw in skies over Japan and things like that, and or for that matter, over Britain during the Battle of Britain, if memory serves. They saw some pretty strange things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well,
That's popped up. Um, you know, and I'll leave you with because you mentioned it, I'll leave you with the one thought. You know, probably the best compliment I got on the haunted rock and roll was I was at a book signing, and after the book signing, a lady came up to me and she said, you know, first of all, I don't believe in ghosts at all. I'm a complete skeptic.
mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh God, here it comes. You know, I'm just going to get reamed. And then she said, but I love this book because I learned so much about the history of rock and roll. And that to me is just another great thing about this genre is if you're going to tell a ghost story, you got to tell history. You know, history really is, in a lot of ways, just one big ghost story.
And I can't think of, for the most part, I can't think of anyone I've ever known very well with an interest in one that wasn't fascinated by the other.
Right.
Historians I've met, every member of a historical society I have ever known engaged in ghost hunting.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, and how I write these things is I take stuff that I'm interested in, and then I explore the ghost lore behind it.
Makes sense to me. It's a good choice. And man, it's like you could probably do another hour just picking your brain about the World War II stuff, particularly because one of the episodes that I keep promising to do, and the mountain of research I need to seriously do to do it properly, is the occult aspects within the Nazi Party. And it's
I write about that too.
And as I'm sure you know, there's definitely elements there when you get into Himmler and the SS and some of the crazy things they did. But there's so much nonsense out there as well.
Yeah, that's what I found. And also there's the simple fact, a lot of those top Nazi officials, although they were evil, they weren't necessarily devil worshippers. A lot of them were atheists and were against the occult because they wanted nothing to interfere with the worship of the state, which was the most important god for them.
Very true. I mean, the classic example that you see in TV shows, movies, and comic books all the time, the Thule Society. And Hitler outlawed the Thule Society.
Mm-hmm.
And people tried to explain that. You know, people lecture me about, oh, Hitler was a high-ranking member of the Thules. It's like, you realize he banned them from Germany?
Yeah, he was... essentially, what I got out of it was that he was able to... He would use certain groups, but he was also very wary of those groups that made sure they didn't get enough power or too much power.
Well, the one I've done in video on related to this so far, because it's something I know enough about, was the great question that I listen to people argue with me over all the time, which was what was Hitler's religious beliefs and did he have any? And you have, they have the atheists who usually all say he was Christian. Many Christians turn around and say he was an atheist. And, people who think he was a pagan or an occultist or this and that. And my personal opinion on the subject, from the research that I've done, is I think Hitler thought Hitler was God.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, most narcissists are going to be God because, who else is going to be bigger than them, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was a narcissist, he was a sociopath, he was a psychopath. And if you look at the psychology of sociopaths and psychopaths and narcissists, none of them are religious. They're not atheists, but they usually acknowledge themselves as God. If you think you're God, you're not really a Christian.
Right.
I mean, for heck's sake, we found prayers that were given to German school children in the Hitler Youth where they were praising Hitler in the form of the Lord's Prayer. It's like, that's not a Christian thing to do. That's not an atheist thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's some of the things. And I'll finish this up with Aleister Crowley makes an appearance in this because he apparently got in a magic war with the occultists in Germany, and that corrupts him. Yeah, that's one of the stories I found about that.
I know Crowley factors in a couple of times because one thing Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, was actually good friends with Aleister Crowley.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
he suggested that British intelligence hire Crowley to tell them what the German astrologers were telling the German government to do. Because there was this belief at the time that Hitler was big into astrology, although, as I understand, they've since realized no, he wasn't. He didn't believe in that either. He, like you said, he used it as a way to manipulate people. He didn't actually think it was true.
Exactly.
On the other
Exactly.
hand, there's also the one Nazi who was a believer in the occult, who took it upon himself to fly to Great Britain to broker a peace deal.
Yeah.
And again, Fleming wanted to bring in Crawley to help interrogate the guy.
Well, what I found was that there are rumors, and of course, rumors on top of rumors that it was Crowley's um, spell that brought him over. And
Huh?
I can't. It wasn't Goebbels. It was
No, Spear? Am I
Spear.
wrong?
It
Yeah.
no, no, I can't remember.
It was
Uh,
actually a fairly. I mean, it wasn't a minor figure. It was a fairly
no, he was.
important figure.
I think he was the number 3 ranking behind Hitler. Maybe it was
Rudolf
Spear.
Hess. Rudolf Hess.
Hess. Okay, Hess. Yep.
He's the one who flew to England. And all of this
Right.
has also led to the theory. I don't know if you've heard it or not, but there's a relatively recent theory that Crowley actually was working for British intelligence.
Yep. Yep.
I don't
Yeah.
think I believe it, but it's an interesting theory.
Yeah, well, the thing about Crowley is I mean, he was equal parts BSer as he was truthful. So it
Yeah,
is
very true.
nearly impossible to tease out exactly what the truth is. But I'll tell you what, when I get it out there, I'd love to get on
Yeah,
and talk to you about it.
absolutely. You're very much welcome back, and I think we'll have a good conversation when that one comes
Yeah,
out.
be great.
But okay, we've hit. It's actually just about 10 o'clock now. I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been an enormous amount of fun, folks. If you're interested, I put a link in the description of this video to the place on Amazon where you can buy Ghosts of Country Music. I highly recommend you guys check it out. Um, Tune in next week. We're going to have Mr. Creepypasta on if you've missed the previous announcements about that. And I am working on new guests to have on for March. So we'll have plenty more coming. Matt, I want to thank you again. It's a great time. You've got my email address. Feel free to please do keep in touch. I do want to have you on again in the future. We clearly have plenty more we can talk about.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you very much. This was fascinating. I love I love being on shows where we have this type of interaction. We can really talk about not just the ghost stories, but all of the fascinating aspects of ghost lore and ghost stories. I really appreciate it, and
My pleasure.
please keep in touch with me, and
I
if
will.
and we'll do this again.
We will. We'll do it again sometime soon. But
Okay, thank
that's
you.
it for tonight, everyone. Have a great night. And Matt, thank you again. Have a good evening. I'll
You're
send you
welcome.
a link
Thank
to the
you.
video once everything's done processing.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.